Life of Mine Part 3. I joined the school in the autumn of 1830 simply with the intention of qualifying myself for the leaving examination by merely nominal attendance there. The chief thing in connection with it was that I and friends of the same bent succeeded in establishing a sham students' association called the Freshmen's Club. It was formed with all possible pedantry. The institution of the comment was introduced, fencing practice and sword bouts were held, and an inaugural meeting to which several prominent students were invited, and at which I presided as vice in white buckskin trousers and great jackboots, gave me a foretaste of the delights awaiting me as a full-blown son of the Muses. The masters of St. Thomas's, however, were not quite so ready to fall in with my aspirations to studentship. At the end of the half-year they were of the opinion that I had not given a thought to their institution, and nothing could persuade them that I had earned a title to academic citizenship by any acquisition of knowledge. Some sort of decision was necessary, so I accordingly informed my family that I had made up my mind not to study for a profession at the university, but to become a musician. There was nothing to prevent me matriculating as studiosus musici, and, without therefore troubling myself about the pedantries of the authorities at St. Thomas's, I defiantly quitted that seat of learning from which I had derived small profit, and presented myself forthwith to the rector of the university, whose acquaintance I had made on the evening of the riot, to be enrolled as a student of music. This was accordingly done without further ado, on the payment of the usual fees. I was in a great hurry about it, for in a week the Easter vacation would begin, and the men would go down from Leipzig, when it would be impossible to be elected member of a club until the vacation was over, and to stay all those weeks at home in Leipzig without having the right to wear the coveted colors seemed to me unendurable torture. Straight from the rector's presence I ran like a wounded animal to the fencing school, to present myself for admission to the Saxon Club, showing my card of matriculation. I attained my object. I could wear the colors of the Saxonia, which was in the fashion at that time, and in great request because it numbered so many delightful members in its ranks. The strangest fate was to befall me in this Easter vacation, during which I was really the only remaining representative of the Saxon Club in Leipzig. In the beginning this club consisted chiefly of men of good family as well as the better class elements of the student world. All of them were members of highly placed and well-to-do families in Saxony in general, and in particular from the capital, Dresden, and spent their vacation at their respective homes. There remained in Leipzig during the vacations only those wandering students who had no homes, and for whom in reality it was always or never holiday time. Among those a separate club had arisen of daring and desperate young reprobates who had found a last refuge, as I said, at Leipzig in the glorious period I have recorded. I had already made the personal acquaintance of these swashbucklers, who pleased my fancy greatly, when they were guarding the Brockhaus grounds. Although the regular duration of a university course did not exceed 3 years, most of these men had never left their universities for 6 or 7 years. I was particularly fascinated by a man called Gebhardt, who was endowed with extraordinary physical beauty and strength, and whose slim heroic figure towered head and shoulders above all his companions. When he walked down the street arm in arm with two of the strongest of his comrades, he used suddenly to take it into his head, by an easy movement of his arm, to lift his friends high in the air and flutter along in this way as though he had a pair of human wings. When a cab was going along the streets at a sharp trot, he would seize a spoke of the wheel with one hand and force it to pull up. Nobody ever told him that he was stupid because they were afraid of his strength, hence his limitations were scarcely noticed. His redoubtable strength, combined with a temperate disposition, lent him a majestic dignity which placed him above the level of an ordinary mortal. He had come to Leipzig from Mecklenburg in the company of a certain Digello, who was as powerful and adroit, though by no means of such gigantic proportions, as his friend, and whose chief attraction lay in his great vivacity and animated features. He had led a wild and dissipated life in which play, drink, passionate love affairs, and constant and prompt dueling had rung the changes. Ceremonious politeness, an ironic and pedantic coldness, which testified to bold self-confidence, combined with a very hot temper, formed the chief characteristics of this personage and natures akin to his. Digello's wildness and passion were lent a curious diabolical charm by the possession of a malicious humor which he often turned against himself, whereas towards others he exercised a certain chivalrous tenderness. These two extraordinary men were joined by others who possessed all the qualities essential to a reckless life, together with real and headstrong valor. One of them, named Stelzer, a regular berserker out of the Nibelungenlied, who was nicknamed Lope, was in his 20th term. While these men openly and consciously belonged to a world doomed to destruction, and all their actions and escapades could only be explained by the hypothesis that they all believed that inevitable ruin was imminent, I made in their company the acquaintance of a certain Schroeter, who particularly attracted me by his cordial disposition, pleasant Hanoverian accent, and refined wit. He was not one of the regular young daredevils, towards whom he adopted a calm observant attitude, while they were all fond of him and glad to see him. I made a real friend of this Schroeter, although he was much older than I was. Through him I became acquainted with the works and poems of H. Heine, and from him I acquired a certain neat and saucy wit, and I was quite ready to surrender myself to his agreeable influence in the hope of improving my outward bearing. It was his company in particular that I sought every day. In the afternoon I generally met him in the Rosenthal or Kinch's chalet, though always in the presence of those wonderful Goths who excited at once my alarm and admiration. They all belonged to university clubs which were on hostile terms with the one of which I was a member. What this hostility between the various clubs meant only those can judge who are familiar with the tone prevalent among them in those days. The mere sight of hostile colors sufficed to infuriate these men, who otherwise were kind and gentle, provided they had taken the slightest drop too much. At all events, As long as the old stagers were sober, they would look with good-natured complacency at a slight young fellow like me in the hostile colors moving among them so amicably. Those colors I wore in my own peculiar fashion. I had made use of the brief week during which my club was still in Leipzig to become the possessor of a splendid Saxon cap, richly embroidered with silver, and worn by a man called Müller, who was afterwards a prominent constable at Dresden. I had been seized with such a violent craving for this cap that I managed to buy it from him, as he wanted money to go home. In spite of this remarkable cap, I was, as I have said, welcome in the den of this band of rowdies. My friend Schroeter saw to that. It was only when the grog, which was the principal beverage of these wild spirits, began to work that I used to notice curious glances and overhear doubtful speeches, the significance of which was for some time hidden from me by the dizziness in which my own senses were plunged by this baneful drink. As I was inevitably bound on this account to be mixed up in quarrels for some time to come, it afforded me a great satisfaction that my first fight, as a matter of fact, arose from an incident more creditable to me than those provocations which I had left half unnoticed. One day Digello came up to Schroeter and me in a wine bar that we often frequented, and in quite a friendly manner confessed to us confidentially his liking for a young and very pretty actress whose talent Schroeter disputed. Digello rejoined that this was as it might be, but that, for his part, he regarded the young lady as the most respectable woman in the theatre. I at once asked him if he considered my sister's reputation was not as good. According to students' notions, it was impossible for Digello, who doubtless had not the remotest intention of being insulting, to give me any assurance further than to say that he certainly did not think my sister had an inferior reputation, but that, nevertheless, he meant to abide by his assertion concerning the young lady he had mentioned. Hereupon followed without delay the usual challenge, opening with the words, "You're an ass," which sounded almost ridiculous to my own ears when I said them to this seasoned swashbuckler. I remember that Digello too gasped with astonishment, and lightning seemed to flash from his eyes, but he controlled himself in the presence of my friend, and proceeded to observe the usual formalities of a challenge, and chose broadswords, crumb sable, as the weapons for the fight. The event made a great stir among our companions, but I saw less reason than before to abstain from my usual intercourse with them. Only I became more strict about the behavior of the swashbucklers, and for several days no evening passed without producing a challenge between me and some formidable bully, until at last Count Soms, the only member of my club who had returned to Leipzig as yet, visited me as though he were an intimate friend and inquired into what had occurred. He applauded my conduct, but advised me not to wear my colors until the return of our comrades from the vacation, and to keep away from the bad company into which I had ventured. Fortunately, I had not long to wait. University life soon began again, and the fencing ground was filled. The unenviable position, in which, in student phrase, I was suspended with a half-dozen of the most terrible swordsmen, earned me a glorious reputation among the freshmen and juniors, and even among the older champions of the Saxonia. My seconds were duly arranged, the dates for the various duels on hand settled, and by the care of my seniors the needful time was secured for me to acquire some sort of skill in fencing. The light heart with which I awaited the fate which threatened me in at least one of the impending encounters I myself could not understand at the time. On the other hand, the way in which that fate preserved me from the consequences of my rashness seems truly miraculous in my eyes to this day, and worthy of further description. The preparations for a duel included obtaining some experience of these encounters by being present at several of them. We freshmen attained this object by what is called carrying duty, that is to say, we were entrusted with the rapiers of the corps, precious weapons of honor belonging to the association, and had to take them first to the grinder and thence to the scene of encounter, a proceeding which was attended with some danger, as it had to be done surreptitiously, since dueling was forbidden by law. In return we acquired the right of assisting as spectators at the impending engagements. When I had earned this honor, the meeting place chosen for the duel I was to watch was the billiard room of an inn in the Bergstrasse. The table had been moved to one side, and on it the authorized spectators took their places. Among them I stood up with a beating heart to watch the dangerous encounters between those doughty champions. I was told on this occasion of the story of one of my friends, a Jew named Levi, but known as Lippert, who on this very floor had given so much ground before his antagonist that the door had to be opened for him, and he fell back through it down the steps into the street, still believing he was engaged in the duel. When several bouts had been finished, two men came onto the pitch, Temple, the president of the Markomannen, and a certain Wolfart, an old stager, already in his 14th half-year of study, with whom I also was booked for an encounter later on. When this was the case, a man was not allowed to watch, in order that the weak points of the duelist might not be betrayed to his future opponent. Wolfart was accordingly asked by my chiefs whether he wanted me removed, whereupon he replied with calm contempt, "Let them leave the little freshman there, in God's name." Thus I became an eyewitness of the disablement of a swordsman who nevertheless showed himself so experienced and skillful on the occasion that I might well have become alarmed for the issue of my future encounter with him. His gigantic opponent cut the artery of his right arm, which at once ended the fight. The surgeon declared that Wolfart would not be able to hold a sword again for years, under which circumstances my proposed meeting with him was at once cancelled. I do not deny that this incident cheered my soul. Shortly afterwards the first general reunion of our club was held at the Green Tap. These gatherings are regular hotbeds for the production of duels. Here I brought upon myself a new encounter with one Tischer, but learned at the same time that I had been relieved of two of my most formidable previous engagements of the kind by the disappearance of my opponents, both of whom had escaped on account of debt and left no trace behind them. The only one of whom I could hear anything was the terrible Stelzer, surnamed Lope. This fellow had taken advantage of the passing of Polish refugees, who had at that time already been driven over the frontier and were making their way through Germany to France, to disguise himself as an ill-starred champion of freedom, and he subsequently found his way to the Foreign Legion in Algeria. On the way home from the gathering, De Jello, whom I was to meet in a few weeks, proposed a truce. This was a device which, if it was accepted, as it was in this case, enabled the future combatants to entertain and talk to one another, which was otherwise most strictly forbidden. We wandered back to the town arm in arm. With chivalrous tenderness, my interesting and formidable opponent declared that he was delighted at the prospect of crossing swords with me in a few weeks' time, that he regarded it as an honor and a pleasure, as he was fond of me and respected me for my valorous conduct. Seldom has any personal success flattered me more. We embraced, and amid protestations which, owing to a certain dignity about them, acquired a significance I can never forget, we parted. He informed me that he must first pay a visit to Jena, where he had an appointment to fight a duel. A week later the news of his death reached Leipzig. He had been mortally wounded in the duel at Jena. I felt as if I were living in a dream, out of which I was aroused by the announcement of my encounter with Tisha. Though he was a first-rate and vigorous fighter, he had been chosen by our chiefs for my first passage of arms because he was fairly short. In spite of being unable to feel any great confidence in my hastily acquired and little practiced skill in fencing, I looked forward to this my first duel with a light heart. Although it was against the rules, I never dreamed of telling the authorities that I was suffering from a slight rash which I had caught at that time, and which I was informed made wounds so dangerous that if it were reported it would postpone the meeting, in spite of the fact that I was modest enough to be prepared for wounds. I was sent for at 10 in the morning, and left home smiling to think what my mother and sisters would say if in a few hours I were brought back in the alarming state I anticipated. My chief, Herr versus Schonfeld, was a pleasant, quiet sort of man, who lived on the marsh. When I reached his house, he leant out of the window with his pipe in his mouth, and greeted me with the words, "You can go home, my lad, it is all off. Tisha is in hospital." When I got upstairs I found several leading men assembled, from whom I learned that Tisha had got very drunk the night before, and had in consequence laid himself open to the most outrageous treatment by the inhabitants of a house of ill fame. He was terribly hurt, and had been taken by the police in the first instance to the hospital. This inevitably meant rustication, and, above all, expulsion from the academic association to which he belonged. I cannot clearly recall the incidents that removed from Leipzig the few remaining fire-eaters to whom I had pledged myself since that fatal vacation time. I only know that this aid of my fame as a student yielded to another. We celebrated the freshmen's gathering, to which all those who could manage it drove a four-in-hand in a long procession through the town. After the president of the club had profoundly moved me with his sudden and yet prolonged solemnity, I conceived the desire to be among the very last to return home from the outing. Accordingly, I stayed away 3 days and 3 nights, and spent the time chiefly in gambling, a pastime which from the first night of our festivity cast its devilish snares around me. Some half-dozen of the smartest club members chanced to be together at early dawn in the Jolly Peasant, and forthwith formed the nucleus of a gambling club, which was reinforced during the day by recruits coming back from the town. Members came to see whether we were still at it, members also went away, but I with the original 6 held out for days and nights without faltering. The desire that first prompted me to take part in the play was the wish to win enough for my score. 2 thalers this I succeeded in doing, and thereupon I was inspired with the hope of being able to settle all the debts I had made at that time by my winnings at play. Just as I had hoped to learn composition most quickly by Logius' method, but had found myself hampered in my object for a long period by unexpected difficulties, so my plan for speedily improving my financial position was likewise doomed to disappointment. To win was not such an easy matter, and for some 3 months I was such a victim to the rage for gambling that no other passion was able to exercise the slightest influence over my mind. Neither the Fechtboden, where the students' fights were practiced, nor the beerhouse, nor the actual scene of the fights, ever saw my face again. In my lamentable position I racked my brains all day to devise ways and means of getting the money wherewith to gamble at night. In vain did my poor mother try everything in her power to induce me not to come home so late at night, although she had no idea of the real nature of my debauches. After I had left the house in the afternoon I never returned till dawn the next day, and I reached my room, which was at some distance from the others, by climbing over the gate, for my mother had refused to give me a latch-key. In despair over my ill luck, my passion for gambling grew into a veritable mania, and I no longer felt any inclination for those things which at one time had lured me to student life. I became absolutely indifferent to the opinion of my former companions and avoided them entirely. I now lost myself in the smaller gambling dens of Leipzig, where only the very scum of the students congregated. Insensible to any feeling of self-respect, I bore even the contempt of my sister Rosalie, both she and my mother hardly ever deigning to cast a glance at the young libertine whom they only saw at rare intervals, looking deadly pale and worn out. My ever-growing despair made me at last resort to foolhardiness as the only means of forcing hostile fate to my side. It suddenly struck me that only by dint of big stakes could I make big profits. To this end I decided to make use of my mother's pension, of which I was trustee of a fairly large sum. That night I lost everything I had with me except 1 thaler. The excitement with which I staked that last coin on a card was an experience hitherto quite strange to my young life. As I had had nothing to eat, I was obliged repeatedly to leave the gambling table owing to sickness. With this last thaler I staked my life, for my return to my home was, of course, out of the question. Already I saw myself in the grey dawn, a prodigal son, fleeing from all I held dear, through forest and field towards the unknown. My mood of despair had gained so strong a hold upon me that, when my card won, I immediately placed all the money on a fresh stake, and repeated this experiment until I had won quite a considerable amount. From that moment my luck grew continuously. I gained such confidence that I risked the most hazardous stakes, for suddenly it dawned upon me that this was destined to be my last day with the cards. My good fortune now became so obvious that the bank thought it wise to close. Not only had I won back all the money I had lost, but I had won enough to pay off all my debts as well. My sensations during the whole of this process were of the most sacred nature. I felt as if God and His angels were standing by my side and were whispering words of warning and of consolation into my ears. Once more I climbed over the gate of my home in the early hours of the morning, this time to sleep peacefully and soundly and to awake very late, strengthened and as though born again. No sense of shame deterred me from telling my mother, to whom I presented her money, the whole truth about this decisive night. I voluntarily confessed my sin in having utilized her pension, sparing no detail. She folded her hands and thanked God for His mercy, and forthwith regarded me as saved, believing it impossible for me ever to commit such a crime again. And, truth to tell, gambling had lost all fascination for me from that moment. The world, in which I had moved like one demented, suddenly seemed stripped of all interest or attraction. My rage for gambling had already made me quite indifferent to the usual student's vanities, and when I was freed from this passion also, I suddenly found myself face to face with an entirely new world. To this world I belonged henceforth. It was the world of real and serious musical study, to which I now devoted myself heart and soul. Even during this wild period of my life, my musical development had not been entirely at a standstill. On the contrary, it daily became plainer that music was the only direction towards which my mental tendencies had a marked bent. Only I had got quite out of the habit of musical study. Even now it seems incredible that I managed to find time in those days to finish quite a substantial amount of composition. I have but the faintest recollection of an overture in C major, 6/8 time, and of a sonata in B-flat major arranged as a duet. The latter pleased my sister Ottilie, who played it with me, so much that I arranged it for orchestra. But another work of this period, an overture in B-flat major, left an indelible impression on my mind on account of an incident connected with it. This composition, in fact, was the outcome of my study of Beethoven's Ninth Symphony in about the same degree as Leopold und Adelaide was the result of my study of Shakespeare. I had made a special point of bringing out the mystic meaning in the orchestra, which I divided into three distinctly different and opposite elements. I wanted to make the characteristic nature of these elements clear to the score reader the moment he looked at it by a striking display of color, and only the fact that I could not get any green ink made this picturesque idea impossible. I employed black ink for the brass instruments alone. The strings were to have red and the wind green ink. This extraordinary score I gave for perusal to Heinrich Dorn, who was at that time musical director of the Leipzig Theatre. He was very young, and impressed me as being a very clever musician and a witty man of the world, whom the Leipzig public made much of. Nevertheless, I have never been able to understand how he could have granted my request to produce this overture. Some time afterwards I was rather inclined to believe with others, who knew how much he enjoyed a good joke, that he intended to treat himself to a little fun. At the time, however, he vowed that he thought the work interesting, and maintained that if it were only brought out as a hitherto unknown work by Beethoven, the public would receive it with respect, though without understanding. It was the Christmas of the fateful year 1830. As usual, there would be no performance at the theatre on Christmas Eve, but instead a concert for the poor had been organized, which received but scant support. The first item on the program was called by the exciting title New Overture, Nothing More. I had surreptitiously listened to the rehearsal with some misgiving. I was very much impressed by the coolness with which Dawn fenced with the apparent confusion which the members of the orchestra showed with regard to this mysterious composition. The principal theme of the allegro was contained in 4 bars. After every 4th bar, however, a 5th bar had been inserted, which had nothing to do with the melody, and which was announced by a loud bang on the kettle drum on the 2nd beat. As this drum beat stood out alone, the drummer, who continually thought he was making a mistake, got confused, and did not give the right sharpness to the accent as prescribed by the score. Listening from my hidden corner, and frightened at my original intention, this accidentally different rendering did not displease me. To my genuine annoyance, however, Dawn called the drummer to the front and insisted on his playing the accents with the prescribed sharpness. When, after the rehearsal, I told the musical director of my misgivings about this important fact, I could not get him to promise a milder interpretation of the fatal drumbeat. He stuck to it that the thing would sound very well as it was. In spite of this assurance, my restlessness grew, and I had not the courage to introduce myself to my friends in advance as the author of the new overture. My sister Ottilie, who had already been forced to survive the secret readings of Leopold und Adelaide, was the only person willing to come with me to hear my work. It was Christmas Eve, and there was to be the usual Christmas tree, presents, etc., at my brother-in-law's, Friedrich Brockhaus, and both of us naturally wanted to be there. My sister, in particular, who lived there, had a good deal to do with the arrangements, and could only get away for a short while, and that with great difficulty. Our amiable relation accordingly had the carriage ready for her so that she might get back more quickly. I made use of this opportunity to inaugurate, as it were, my entry into the musical world in a festive manner. The carriage drew up in front of the theatre. Ottilie went into my brother-in-law's box, which forced me to try and find a seat in the pit. I had forgotten to buy a ticket, and was refused admission by the man at the door. Suddenly the tuning up of the orchestra grew louder and louder, and I thought I should have to miss the beginning of my work. In my anxiety I revealed myself to the man at the door as the composer of the new overture, and in this way succeeded in passing without a ticket. I pushed my way through to one of the first rows of the pit, and sat down in terrible anxiety. The overture began. After the theme of the black brass instruments had made itself heard with great emphasis, the red allegro theme started, in which, as I have already mentioned, every fifth bar was interrupted by the drum beat from the black world. What kind of effect the green theme of the wind instruments, which joined in afterwards, produced upon the listeners, and what they must have thought when black, red, and green themes became intermingled, has always remained a mystery to me, for the fatal drum beat, brutally hammered out, entirely deprived me of my senses, especially as this prolonged and continually recurring effect now began to rouse, not only the attention, but the merriment of the audience. I heard my neighbors calculating the return of this effect. Knowing the absolute correctness of their calculation, I suffered 10,000 torments, and became almost unconscious. At last I awoke from my nightmare when the overture, to which I had disdained to give what I considered a trite ending, came to a standstill most unexpectedly. No phantoms like those in Hoffmann's tales could have succeeded in producing the extraordinary state in which I came to my senses on noticing the astonishment of the audience at the end of the performance. I heard no exclamations of disapproval, no hissing, no remarks, not even laughter. All I saw was intense astonishment at such a strange occurrence, which impressed them, as it did me, like a horrible nightmare. The worst moment, however, came when I had to leave the pit and take my sister home. To get up and pass through the people in the pit was horrible indeed. Nothing, however, equaled the pain of coming face to face with the man at the door. The strange look he gave me haunted me ever afterwards, and for a considerable time I avoided the pit of the Leipzig theatre. My next step was to find my sister, who had gone through the whole sad experience with infinite pity. In silence we drove home to be present at a brilliant family festivity, which contrasted with grim irony with the gloom of my bewilderment. In spite of it all I tried to believe in myself, and thought I could find comfort in my overture to the Braut von Messina, which I believed to be a better work than the fatal one I had just heard. A reinstatement, however, was out of the question, for the directors of the Leipzig theatre regarded me for a long time as a very doubtful person, in spite of Dorn's friendship. It is true that I still tried my hand at sketching out compositions to Goethe's Faust, some of which have been preserved to this day. But soon my wild student's life resumed its sway and drowned the last remnant of serious musical study in me. I now began to imagine that because I had become a student I ought to attend the university lectures. From Traugott Krug, who was well known to me on account of his having suppressed the students' revolt, I tried to learn the first principles of philosophy. A single lesson sufficed to make me give this up. 2 or 3 times, however, I attended the lectures on aesthetics given by one of the younger professors, a man called Weiss. This perseverance was due to the interest which Weiss immediately aroused in me. When I made his acquaintance at my uncle Adolph's house, Weiss had just translated the Metaphysics of Aristotle, and, if I am not mistaken, dedicated them in a controversial spirit to Hegel. On this occasion I had listened to the conversation of these two men on philosophy and philosophers, which made a tremendous impression on me. I remember that Weiss was an absent-minded man, with a hasty and abrupt manner of speaking. He had an interesting and pensive expression which impressed me immensely. I recollect how, on being accused of a want of clearness in his writing and style, he justified himself by saying that the deep problems of the human mind could not in any case be solved by the mob. This maxim, which struck me as being very plausible, I at once accepted as the principle for all my future writing. I remember that my eldest brother Albert, to whom I once had to write for my mother, grew so disgusted with my letter and style that he said he thought I must be going mad. In spite of my hopes that Weiss's lectures would do me much good, I was not capable of continuing to attend them, as my desires in those days drove me to anything but the study of aesthetics. Nevertheless, my mother's anxiety at this time on my behalf made me try to take up music again. As Müller, the teacher under whom I had studied till that time, had not been able to inspire me with a permanent love of study, it was necessary to discover whether another teacher might not be better able to induce me to do serious work. Theodor Weinlich, who was choirmaster and musical director at St. Thomas's Church, held at that time this important and ancient post, which was afterwards occupied by Schicht, and before him by no less a person than Sebastian Bach. By education he belonged to the old Italian school of music, and had studied in Bologna under Pater Martini. He had made a name for himself in this art by his vocal compositions, in which his fine manner of treating the parts was much praised. He himself told me one day that a Leipzig publisher had offered him a very substantial fee if he would write for his firm another book of vocal exercises similar to the one which had proved so profitable to his first publisher. Weinlich told him that he had not got any exercises of the kind ready at the moment, but offered him instead a new mass, which the publisher refused with the words, "Let him who got the meat nor the bones." The modesty with which Weinlich told me this little story showed how excellent a man he was. As he was in a very bad and weak state of health when my mother introduced me to him, he at first refused to take me as a pupil. But, after having resisted all persuasions, he at last took pity on my musical education, which, as he soon discovered from a fugue which I had brought with me, was exceedingly faulty. He accordingly promised to teach me, on condition that I should give up all attempts at composing for 6 months, and follow his instructions implicitly. To the first part of my promise I remained faithful, thanks to the vast vortex of dissipation into which my life as a student had drawn me. When, however, I had to occupy myself for any length of time with nothing but 4-part harmony exercises in strictly rigorous style, it was not only the student in me, but also the composer of so many overtures and sonatas, that was thoroughly disgusted. Weinlich, too, had his grievances against me, and decided to give me up. During this period I came to the crisis of my life, which led to the catastrophe of that terrible evening at the gambling den. But an even greater blow than this fearful experience awaited me when Weinlich decided not to have anything more to do with me. Deeply humiliated and miserable, I besought the gentle old man, whom I loved dearly, to forgive me, and I promised him from that moment to work with unflagging energy. One morning at 7 o'clock Weinlich sent for me to begin the rough sketch for a fugue. He devoted the whole morning to me, following my work bar by bar with the greatest attention, and giving me his valuable advice. At 12 o'clock he dismissed me with the instruction to perfect and finish the sketch by filling in the remaining parts at home. When I brought him the fugue finished, he handed me his own treatment of the same theme for comparison. This common task of fugue writing established between me and my good-natured teacher the tenderest of ties, for, from that moment, we both enjoyed the lessons. I was astonished how quickly the time flew. In 8 weeks I had not only gone through a number of the most intricate fugues, but had also waded through all kinds of difficult evolutions in counterpoint, when one day, on bringing him an extremely elaborate double fugue, he took my breath away by telling me that after this there was nothing left for him to teach me. As I was not aware of any great effort on my part, I often wondered whether I had really become a well-equipped musician. Weinlich himself did not seem to attach much importance to what he had taught me. He said, "Probably you will never write fugues or canons, but what you have mastered is independence. You can now stand alone and rely upon having a fine technique at your fingers' ends if you should want it." The principal result of his influence over me was certainly the growing love of clearness and fluency to which he had trained me. I had already had to write the above-mentioned fugue for ordinary voices. My feeling for the melodious and vocal had in this way been awakened. In order to keep me strictly under his calming and friendly influence, he had at the same time given me a sonata to write which, as a proof of my friendship for him, I had to build up on strictly harmonic and thematic lines, for which he recommended me a very early and childlike sonata by Payal as a model. Those who had only recently heard my overture must, indeed, have wondered how I ever wrote this sonata, which has been published through the indiscretion of Messrs. Breitkopf and Hartel. To reward me for my abstemiousness, Weinlich induced them to publish this poor composition. From that moment he gave me a free hand. To begin with, I was allowed to compose a fantasia for the pianoforte, in F-sharp minor, which I wrote in a quite informal style by treating the melody in recitative form. This gave me intense satisfaction because it won me praise from Weinlich. Soon afterwards I wrote 3 overtures which all met with his entire approval. In the following winter, 1831 to 1832, I succeeded in getting the first of them, in D minor, performed at one of the Gewandhaus concerts. At that time a very simple and homely tone reigned supreme in this institution. The instrumental works were not conducted by what we call a conductor of the orchestra, but were simply played to the audience by the leader of the orchestra. As soon as the singing began, Polenz took his place at the conductor's desk. He belonged to the type of fat and pleasant musical directors, and was a great favorite with the Leipzig public. He used to come on the platform with a very important-looking blue baton in his hand. One of the strangest events which occurred at that time was the yearly production of the Ninth Symphony of Beethoven. After the first 3 movements had been played straight through like a Haydn symphony, as well as the orchestra could manage it, Polenz, instead of having to conduct a vocal quartet, a cantata, or an Italian aria, took his place at the desk to undertake this highly complicated instrumental work, with its particularly enigmatical and incoherent opening, one of the most difficult tasks that could possibly be found for a musical conductor. I shall never forget the impression produced upon me at the first rehearsal by the anxiously and carefully played 3/4 time, and the way in which the wild shrieks of the trumpet, with which this movement begins, resulted in the most extraordinary confusion of sound. He had evidently chosen this tempo in order, in some way, to manage the recitative of the double basses, but it was utterly hopeless. Polenz was in a bath of perspiration, the recitative did not come off, and I really began to think that Beethoven must have written nonsense. The double bass player, Temmler, a faithful veteran of the orchestra, prevailed upon Polenz at last, in rather coarse and energetic language, to put down the baton, and in this way the recitative really proceeded properly. All the same, I felt at this time that I had come to the humble conclusion, in a way I can hardly explain, that this extraordinary work was still beyond my comprehension. For a long time I gave up brooding over this composition, and I turned my thoughts with simple longing towards a clearer and calmer musical form. My study of counterpoint had taught me to appreciate, above all, Mozart's light and flowing treatment of the most difficult technical problems, and the last movement of his great symphony in C major in particular served me as example for my own work. My D minor overture, which clearly showed the influence of Beethoven's Coriolanus overture, had been favorably received by the public. My mother began to have faith in me again, and I started at once on a second overture, in C major, which really ended with a fugato that did more credit to my new model than I had ever hoped to accomplish. This overture, also, was soon afterwards performed at a recital given by the favorite singer, Mademoiselle Palazzisi, of the Dresden Italian Opera. Before this I had already introduced it at a concert given by a private musical society called Euterpe, when I had conducted it myself. I remember the strange impression I received from a remark that my mother made on that occasion. As a matter of fact, this work, which was written in a counterpoint style, without any real passion or emotion, had produced a strange effect upon her. She gave vent to her astonishment by warmly praising the Egmont overture, which was played at the same concert, maintaining that this kind of music was after all more fascinating than any stupid fugue. At this time I also wrote, as my third opus, an overture to Raupisch's drama, König Enzio, in which again Beethoven's influence made itself even more strongly felt. My sister Rosalie succeeded in getting it performed at the theatre before the play. For the sake of prudence, they did not announce it on the program the first time. Dawn conducted it, and as the performance went off all right, and the public showed no dissatisfaction, my overture was played with my full name on the program several times during the run of the above-mentioned drama. After this I tried my hand at a big symphony, in C major. In this work I showed what I had learnt by using the influence of my study of Beethoven and Mozart towards the achievement of a really pleasant and intelligible work, in which the fugue was again present at the end, while the themes of the various movements were so constructed that they could be played consecutively. Nevertheless, the passionate and bold element of the Sinfonia Eroica was distinctly discernible, especially in the first movement. The slow movement, on the contrary, contained reminiscences of my former musical mysticism. A kind of repeated interrogative exclamation of the minor third merging into the fifth connected in my mind this work, which I had finished with the utmost effort at clearness, with my very earliest period of boyish sentimentality. When, in the following year, I called on Friedrich Rochlitz, at that time the Nestor of the musical aesthetes in Leipzig, and president of the Gewandhaus, I prevailed upon him to promise me a performance of my work. As he had been given my score for perusal before seeing me, he was quite astonished to find that I was a very young man, for the character of my music had prepared him to see a much older and more experienced musician. Before this performance took place, many things happened which I must first mention, as they were of great importance to my life. My short and stormy career as a student had drowned in me not only all longing for further development, but also all interest in intellectual and spiritual pursuits. Although, as I have pointed out, I had never alienated myself entirely from music, my revived interest in politics aroused my first real disgust for my senseless student's life, which soon left no deeper traces on my mind than the remembrance of a terrible nightmare. The Polish War of Independence against Russian supremacy filled me with growing enthusiasm. The victories which the Poles obtained for a short period during May 1831 aroused my enthusiastic admiration. It seemed to me as though the world had, by some miracle, been created anew. As a contrast to this, the news of the Battle of Ostralenka made it appear as if the end of the world had come. To my astonishment, my boon companions scoffed at me when I commented upon some of these events. The terrible lack of all fellow feeling and comradeship amongst the students struck me very forcibly. Any kind of enthusiasm had to be smothered or turned into pedantic bravado, which showed itself in the form of affectation and indifference. To get drunk with deliberate cold-bloodedness, without even a glimpse of humor, was reckoned almost as brave a feat as dueling. Not until much later did I understand the far nobler spirit which animated the lower classes in Germany in comparison with the sadly degenerate state of the university students. In those days I felt terribly indignant at the insulting remarks which I brought upon myself when I deplored the Battle of Ostralenka. To my honor be it said, that these and similar impressions helped to make me give up my low associates. During my studies with Weinlich, the only little dissipation I allowed myself was my daily evening visit to Kinchi, the confectioner in the Klostergasse, where I passionately devoured the latest newspapers. Here I found many men who held the same political views as myself, and I specially loved to listen to the eager political discussions of some of the old men who frequented the place. The literary journals, too, began to interest me. I read a great deal, but was not very particular in my choice. Nevertheless, I now began to appreciate intelligence and wit, whereas before only the grotesque and the fantastic had had any attraction for me. My interest in the issue of the Polish War, however, remained paramount. I felt the siege and capture of Warsaw as a personal calamity. My excitement when the remains of the Polish army began to pass through Leipzig on their way to France was indescribable, and I shall never forget the impression produced upon me by the first batch of these unfortunate soldiers on the occasion of their being quartered at the Green Shield, a public house in the meat market. Much as this depressed me, I was soon roused to a high pitch of enthusiasm, for in the lounge of the Leipzig Gewandhaus, where that night Beethoven's C minor symphony was being played, a group of heroic figures, the principal leaders of the Polish Revolution, excited my admiration. I felt more particularly attracted by Count Vincenz Tyszkiewicz, a man of exceptionally powerful physique and noble appearance, who impressed me by his dignified and aristocratic manner and his quiet self-reliance, qualities with which I had not met before. When I saw a man of such kingly bearing in a tight-fitting coat and red velvet cap, I at once realized my foolishness in ever having worshipped the ludicrously dressed-up little heroes of our students' world. I was delighted to meet this gentleman again at the house of my brother-in-law, Friedrich Brockhaus, where I saw him frequently. My brother-in-law had the greatest pity and sympathy for the Polish rebels, and was the president of a committee whose task it was to look after their interests, and for a long time he made many personal sacrifices for their cause. The Brockhaus establishment now became tremendously attractive to me. Around Count Vincenz Tyszkiewicz, who remained the lodestar of this small Polish world, gathered a great many other wealthy exiles, amongst whom I chiefly remember a cavalry captain of the name of Bantsma, a man of unlimited kindness, but of a rather frivolous nature. He possessed a marvelous team of 4 horses which he drove at such breakneck speed as to cause great annoyance to the people of Leipzig. Another man of importance with whom I remember dining was General Bem, whose artillery had made such a gallant stand at Ostrolenka. Many other exiles passed through this hospitable house, some of whom impressed us by their melancholy, warlike bearing, others by their refined behavior. Vincenz Tyszkiewicz, however, remained my ideal of a true man, and I loved him with a profound adoration. He, too, began to be interested in me. I used to call upon him nearly every day, and was sometimes present at a sort of martial feast, from which he often withdrew in order to be able to open his heart to me about the anxieties which oppressed him. He had, in fact, received absolutely no news of the whereabouts of his wife and little son since they separated at Volhynian. Besides this, he was under the shadow of a great sorrow which drew all sympathetic natures to him. To my sister Louise he had confided the terrible calamity that had once befallen him. He had been married before, and while staying with his wife in one of his lonely castles, in the dead of night he had seen a ghostly apparition at the window of his bedroom. Hearing his name called several times, he had taken up a revolver to protect himself from possible danger, and had shot his own wife, who had had the eccentric idea of teasing him by pretending to be a ghost. I had the pleasure of sharing his joy on hearing that his family was safe. His wife joined him in Leipzig with their beautiful boy, Jonisch. I felt sorry not to be able to feel the same sympathy for this lady as I did for her husband. Perhaps one of the reasons of my antipathy was the obvious and conspicuous way in which she made herself up, by means of which the poor woman probably tried to hide how much her beauty had suffered through the terrible strain of the past events. She soon went back to Galicia to try and save what she could of their property, and also to provide her husband with a pass from the Austrian government, by means of which he could follow her. Then came the 3rd of May. 18 of the Poles who were still in Leipzig met together at a festive dinner in a hotel outside the town. On this day was to be celebrated the first anniversary of the 3rd of May, so dear to the memory of the Poles. Only the chiefs of the Leipzig Polish Committee received invitations, and as a special favor I also was asked. I shall never forget that occasion. The dinner became an orgy. Throughout the evening a brass band from the town played Polish folk songs, and these were sung by the whole company, led by a Lithuanian called Zon, in a manner now triumphant and now mournful. The beautiful 3rd of May song more particularly drew forth a positive uproar of enthusiasm. Tears and shouts of joy grew into a terrible tumult. The excited men grouped themselves on the grass, swearing eternal friendship in the most extravagant terms, for which the word Ojczyzna, fatherland, provided the principal theme, until at last night threw her veil over this wild debauch. That evening afterwards served me as the theme for an orchestral composition, in the form of an overture, named Polonia. I shall recount the fate of this work later on. My friend Tishkiewicz's passport now arrived, and he made up his mind to go back to Galicia via Brunn, although his friends considered it was very rash of him to do so. I very much wanted to see something of the world, and Tishkiewicz's offer to take me with him induced my mother to consent to my going to Vienna, a place that I had long wished to visit. I took with me the scores of my 3 overtures which had already been performed, and also that of my great symphony as yet unproduced, and had a grand time with my Polish patron, who took me in his luxurious traveling coach as far as the capital of Moravia. During a short stop at Dresden, the exiles of all classes gave our beloved Count a friendly farewell dinner in Pirna, at which the champagne flowed freely, while the health was drunk of the future dictator of Poland. At last we separated at Brunn, from which place I continued my journey to Vienna by coach. During the afternoon and night, which I was obliged to spend in Brunn by myself, I went through terrible agonies from fear of the cholera which, as I unexpectedly heard, had broken out in this place. There I was all alone in a strange place, my faithful friend just departed, and on hearing of the epidemic I felt as if a malicious demon had caught me in his snare in order to annihilate me. I did not betray my terror to the people in the hotel, but when I was shown into a very lonely wing of the house and left by myself in this wilderness, I hid myself in bed with my clothes on, and lived once again through all the horrors of ghost stories as I had done in my boyhood. The cholera stood before me like a living thing. I could see and touch it. It lay in my bed and embraced me. My limbs turned to ice. I felt frozen to the very marrow. Whether I was awake or asleep I never knew. I only remember how astonished I was when, on awakening, I felt thoroughly well and healthy. At last I arrived in Vienna, where I escaped the epidemic which had penetrated as far as that town. It was midsummer of the year 1832. Owing to the introductions I had with me, I found myself very much at home in this lively city, in which I made a pleasant stay of 6 weeks. As my sojourn, however, had no really practical purpose, my mother looked upon the cost of this holiday, short as it seemed, as an unnecessary extravagance on my part. I visited the theatres, heard Strauss, made excursions, and altogether had a very good time. I am afraid I contracted a few debts as well, which I paid off later on when I was conductor of the Dresden Orchestra. I had received very pleasant impressions of musical and theatrical life, and for a long time Vienna lived in my memory as the acme of that extraordinarily productive spirit peculiar to its people. I enjoyed most of all the performances at the theatre in Der Wien, at which they were acting a grotesque fairy play called Die Abentur Fortunates zu Wasser und zu Land, in which a cab was called on the shores of the Black Sea and which made a tremendous impression on me. About the music I was more doubtful. A young friend of mine took me with immense pride to a performance of Gluck's Iphigenia in Tauris, which was made doubly attractive by a first-rate cast including Wilde, Stordigall and Binder. I must confess that on the whole I was bored by this work, but I did not dare say so. My ideas of Gluck had attained gigantic proportions from my reading of Hoffmann's well-known fantasies. My anticipation of this work, therefore, which I had not studied yet, had led me to expect a treatment full of overpowering dramatic force. It is possible that Schröder-Devrient acting in Fidelio had taught me to judge everything by her exalted standard. With the greatest trouble I worked myself up to some kind of enthusiasm for the great scene between Orestes and the Furies. I hoped against hope that I should be able to admire the remainder of the opera. I began to understand the Viennese taste, however, when I saw how great a favorite the opera Zampa became with the public, both at the Kanthner Thor and at the Josephstadt. Both theatres competed vigorously in the production of this popular work, and although the public had seemed mad about Iphigenia, nothing equaled their enthusiasm for Zampa. No sooner had they left the Josephstadt Theatre in the greatest ecstasies about Zampa than they proceeded to the public house called the Strausslein. Here they were immediately greeted by the strains of selections from Zampa which drove the audience to feverish excitement. I shall never forget the extraordinary playing of Johann Strauss, who put equal enthusiasm into everything he played, and very often made the audience almost frantic with delight. At the beginning of a new waltz this demon of the Viennese musical spirit shook like a Pythian priestess on the tripod, and veritable groans of ecstasy, which, without doubt, were more due to his music than to the drinks in which the audience had indulged, raised their worship for the magic violinist to almost bewildering heights of frenzy. The hot summer air of Vienna was absolutely impregnated with Zampa and Strauss. A very poor students' rehearsal at the Conservatoire, at which they performed a mass by Cherubini, seemed to me like an alms paid begrudgingly to the study of classical music. At the same rehearsal one of the professors, to whom I was introduced, tried to make the students play my overture in D minor, the one already performed in Leipzig. I do not know what his opinion was, nor that of the students, with regard to this attempt. I only know they soon gave it up. On the whole I had wandered into doubtful musical bypaths, and I now withdrew from this first educational visit to a great European art centre in order to start on a cheap, but long and monotonous return journey to Bohemia, by stagecoach. My next move was a visit to the house of Count Pachter, of whom I had pleasant recollections from my boyhood days. His estate, Pravonin, was about 8 miles from Prague. Received in the kindest possible way by the old gentleman and his beautiful daughters, I enjoyed his delightful hospitality until late into the autumn. A youth of 19, as I then was, with a fast-growing beard, for which my sisters had already prepared the young ladies by letter, the continual and close intimacy with such kind and pretty girls could hardly fail to make a strong impression on my imagination. Jenny, the elder of the two, was slim, with black hair, blue eyes, and wonderfully noble features. The younger one, August, was a little smaller, and stouter, with a magnificent complexion, fair hair, and brown eyes. The natural and sisterly manner with which both girls treated me and conversed with me did not blind me to the fact that I was expected to fall in love with one or the other of them. It amused them to see how embarrassed I got in my efforts to choose between them, and consequently they teased me tremendously. Unfortunately, I did not act judiciously with regard to the daughters of my host. In spite of their homely education, they belonged to a very aristocratic house, and consequently hesitated between the hope of marrying men of eminent position in their own sphere, and the necessity of choosing husbands amongst the higher middle classes, who could afford to keep them in comfort. The shockingly poor, almost medieval, education of the Austrian so-called cavalier made me rather despise the latter. The girls, too, had suffered from the same lack of proper training. I soon noticed with disgust how little they knew about things artistic, and how much value they attached to superficial things. However much I might try to interest them in those higher pursuits which had become necessary to me, they were incapable of appreciating them. I advocated a complete change from the bad library novels, which represented their only reading, from the Italian operatic arias, sung by August, and, last but not least, from the horsey, insipid cavaliers, who paid their court to both Jenny and her sister in the most coarse and offensive manner. My zeal in this latter respect soon gave rise to great unpleasantness. I became hard and insulting, harangued them about the French Revolution, and begged them with fatherly admonitions for the love of heaven to be content with well-educated middle-class men, and give up those impertinent suitors who could only harm their reputation. The indignation provoked by my friendly advice I often had to ward off with the harshest retorts. I never apologized, but tried by dint of real or feigned jealousy to get our friendship back on the old footing. In this way, undecided, half in love and half angry, one cold November day I said goodbye to these pretty children. I soon met the whole family again at Prague, where I made a long sojourn, without, however, staying at the Count's residence. My stay at Prague was to be of great musical importance to me. I knew the director of the Conservatoire, Dionys Weber, who promised to bring my symphony before the public. I also spent much of my time with an actor called Moritz, to whom, as an old friend of our family, I had been recommended, and there I made the acquaintance of the young musician Kittel. Moritz, who noticed that not a day passed but what I went to the much-feared chief of the Conservatoire upon some pressing musical business, once dispatched me with an improvised parody on Schiller's Bergschaft.